There's a lot of people on the American right today who romanticize the Constitution and the founding fathers as unified and conservative when it comes to their mindset in terms of the creation of the United States of America. And if not conservative, at least classically liberal, as has become popular to say recently. But before we even analyze that, I think it's important to really be clear that this kind of dogmatic reverence towards the Constitution is pretty counterproductive because the mindset of a bunch of dudes more than 200 years ago just doesn't give us the answers that we need to complicated questions about society today. Yeah, we need a system of laws which can only be changed through established processes. That's why countries have constitutions. But the Constitution is not infallible. The founders weren't perfect. The laws that were written in the 18th century aren't all going to be relevant to us forever. But if the right wingers want to insist on projecting their ideology onto the founding fathers and they want to accuse progressives of being the opposite of what the Constitution espouses as values or what the founders espoused as values or what is American political tradition, we kind of have no choice but to point out that the founding fathers and their ideology were progressive, not conservative. Progressive was first used to describe a turn of the 20th century movement that wanted government to reduce wealth inequality, reduce the negative byproducts of industrialization and of capitalism. But those principles weren't new at the time, and they're still espoused by the left today. So for our purposes, when I talk about progressive, I mean a left to center left value system that's compatible with capitalism. It allows for private property, but it prioritizes equality and public safety and public health. And it sees government as a tool to maintain that situation. That philosophy is a primary theme in much of what was said and done by the founding fathers. They were progressive. I think there's no question about it. Let's start with healthcare, okay? In 1798, Congress passed a law signed by then President, founding father John Adams, which established a government-run healthcare program mandating that privately employed sailors buy health insurance. It required ship owners and sailors to each contribute about 1% of the sailors' wages, and most of the medical treatment was administered at hospitals that were owned and operated by the government. There was recently a debate about whether Obama's healthcare mandate was constitutional. The people who wrote this law in 1798 didn't need to speculate about whether the law was compatible with the idea of the Constitution's framers, because many of the members of that Congress were also drafters of the Constitution. The founding fathers involved with this bill supported government healthcare facilities, and mandatory taxes to pay for it, period. These were the founding fathers. So now let's talk more about taxes, because that connects to the healthcare issue. Constitutional conservatives, constitutional fetishists, call them whatever you want. They might not like it, but Thomas Paine was an open advocate for a progressive income tax. James Madison signed into law a progressive estate tax in 1797. Thomas Jefferson prominently supported progressive taxation. In a 1785 letter to James Madison, he said, quote, "The consequences of this enormous inequality producing so much misery to the bulk of mankind, legislators cannot invent too many devices for subdividing property. Another means of silently lessening the inequality of property is to exempt all from taxation below a certain point and to tax the higher portions of property in geometrical progression as they rise. It is not too soon to provide by every possible means that as few as possible shall be without a little portion of land." Modern debates about gun rights are definitely one of the most common places where we hear from the right about how the founding fathers supposedly intended things to be and how liberals today want the opposite. When the Second Amendment was adopted, most states had laws against traveling with a gun or concealing a gun. And the Second Amendment didn't affect this. It wasn't until much later that the Second Amendment was interpreted to guarantee the right to carry a gun in public. When the United States was created, there was nothing like stand your ground laws that exist in some parts of the country today. In the early days, one had a duty to retreat when in danger. Deadly force was justified only if you were in your home and had no other alternative to protect yourself. The stand your ground laws that we see today only started to appear about 100 years after the adoption of the Second Amendment. There was actually a 1786 law here in Boston that regulated how people were allowed to store their guns, requiring them to be unloaded, which apparently didn't conflict with the founders' conception of the Second Amendment. So gun regulation has always existed in the United States. Many of the rights that conservatives claim come from the Second Amendment weren't even rights at all when the Second Amendment took effect. Gun rights advocates later reinterpreted the Constitution to serve their purposes, contrary to the original intent of the founders, which is what they always accuse the left of doing. It's actually complete and utter projection on their behalf. Many of the founding fathers were also progressive when it comes to immigration and pluralism. If you look at his 1791 book, Report on Manufactures, Alexander Hamilton wrote, quote, "Immigrants exhibit a large proportion of ingenious and valuable workmen who by expatriating improved their own condition and added to the industry and wealth of the United States." In Thomas Paine's book, Rights of Man, he wrote, quote, "If there is a country in the world where concord, according to common calculation, would be least expected, it is America, made up as it is of people from different nations, accustomed to different forms and habits of government, speaking different languages and more different in their modes of worship. It would appear that the union of such a people would be impracticable, but by the simple operation of constructing government on the principles of society and the rights of man, every difficulty retires and all the parts are brought into cordial unison. There, the poor are not oppressed, the rich are not privileged." James Madison wrote in 1790, "Freedom of emigration is due to the general interests of humanity, the course of emigrations being always from places where living is more difficult to places where it is less difficult. The happiness of the emigrant is promoted by the change, and as a more numerous progeny is another effect of the same cause. Human life is at once made a greater blessing, and more individuals are created to partake of it." We often hear from today's Christian conservatives that all the founding fathers were Christians and that America was intended to be a Christian nation. Neither is true. And the United States Constitution was actually designed by the founders to explicitly isolate government from religion and to maintain equality across different religious beliefs or even non-belief or absence of belief in religion. To be clear, whether any particular founder was Christian isn't necessarily a matter of whether they were progressive or left-wing or right-wing, but to deal with today's right-wing argument that Christianity and God should influence American lawmaking because the founders were Christian, we have to deal with that first assumption that the founders were, as a whole, Christian, because they were not. First of all, we shouldn't even care what the private religious beliefs of the founding fathers may have been. It might be important if you're writing a biography about them, but if we're talking about the country's founding itself, all that matters are the political and legal philosophies that the founders upheld. The founding didn't require a particular religion. The precursor to the American Revolution was the Enlightenment and other historical revolutions and legal documents. If all of the founders were Christian, it would be because everyone in the West was Christian during that time period, and their Christianity was a coincidence to their political philosophies that they held. But this is really important. The founders were not all Christian. There were many religious skeptics during that period which subscribed to a philosophy called deism, which, unlike Christianity, says that God does not interfere with the physical world or cause supernatural events. There's evidence that central founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin were deists, not Christians. In a letter to John Adams, Thomas Jefferson actually wrote, quote, "The day will come when the mystical generation of Jesus, by the supreme being in the womb of a virgin, will be classed with the fable of the generation of Minerva in the brain of Jupiter. The Declaration of Independence says nothing about God having a role in government or giving power to government. The document conveys that government's power should come only from the people that it governs. The word God doesn't appear anywhere in the US Constitution. And the only references to religion in the Constitution are actually to limit religion's influence on the government. The First Amendment, as many of you know, guarantees that, quote, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And Thomas Jefferson said that this clause, quote, builds a wall of separation between church and state. Article 6 of the Constitution says no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. The Federalist Papers, maybe our best guide to the intentions of the Constitution, never mentions God or religion, except to say that it has no role in government. James Madison, known as the father of the Constitution, wrote in 1774, quote, religious bondage shackles and debilitates the mind and unfits it for every noble enterprise. If you look at Article 11 of the Treaty of Tripoli, signed by John Adams, it says, quote, the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. Now, many will claim that the slogan, in God we trust, came from the founding. This is wrong. It wasn't associated with any American symbols until it appeared on coins in 1864, and it didn't become an official U.S. motto until 1956. Under God wasn't even added to the Pledge of Allegiance until 1954. We see a lot of overlap between American symbols and religion, and many people think that this was the doing of the founders, but it didn't happen until a lot later, a lot of it in the 1950s, and it was caused by deeply religious Dwight Eisenhower and the socially conservative sort of zeitgeist of the time. The founders progressively made it a point to protect minority religious views. As long as people on the right today want to play this game that they claim that the founding fathers were unified in an ideology that matches modern conservatism, we have to tell them they were wrong, and we have to defend it with evidence. The founders were progressive. Much of what they said and wrote and enacted into law runs parallel to today's left-of-center values and policies. They were progressive in that they were forward-thinking and they were subversive. The progressive movement that started at the turn of the 20th century was a further realization of the values of the founders, including the idea that the privileged shouldn't prosper at the expense of common people. This was expressed by the founders deciding to separate from Britain and establish a government meant to empower common people, not just a powerful overclass. The creation of America, as it took place, was in and of itself an extraordinarily progressive act. Progressivism was expressed in the founders' agreement to abolish the first Constitution of America, called the Articles of Confederation, and update and reinvent it into something that they deemed was sort of more useful in a new era, instead of treating those Articles of Confederation as something divine and eternally perfect. We should apply the same logic to the Constitution today, not to mention that they replaced the Articles of Confederation with something far more progressive. Constitution that, in contrast to those first Articles of Confederation, provided a strong central government and a court system, federal taxes, federal trade regulations, legislative representation based on population, looser requirements for adopting new laws in the future and amending the Constitution. So not only were our founders progressive in reimagining our country's fundamental framework into something more practical, they actually reimagined it into something that was far to the left of the decentralized libertarian mess that existed before. But now let's circle back to the very beginning. After everything I've told you about the founding fathers being progressive, we actually shouldn't care so much about the intent of politicians from the 18th century anyway, because it's 2019. When conservatives today tell us that the text of the Constitution and the intent of the framers are all we need to deal with today's problems, in a society that would be unrecognizable to someone that lived 200 years ago doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But as long as conservatives attempt to claim the founders as being exclusively a part of their own ideological tradition, I'd like to point out that it's just as easy, if not easier, to argue that progressivism was a prominent theme during the founding of the United States, and then to argue that a 200-year-old document simply cannot tell us how to solve today's problems. Disagree with me? I definitely want to hear from you.